Today we'll be looking at Unit 6, Notes number 7. This is our last set of notes for this unit. We will be taking our test for Unit 6 on Thursday, so you want to make sure that you have watched all of the notes by Thursday, because I will be putting grades into the gradebook, and that you've completed your key terms and your review sheet. So these notes are titled Victory in the Pacific. So with the war in Europe over, it was time to finish Japan. The U.S. fleet had soundly defeated Japanese resistance. The island of Japan was now surrounded. But still, Japanese resolve was content to fight on to the death, which leads to the prospect of the invasion of Japan. So the U.S. dreaded the possibility of having to invade the island of Japan. All estimates said the cost in lives and resources would be enormous. And so at this point, the war in Europe's done. Hitler, Mussolini have all surrendered, and essentially, Japan, the war in the Pacific is over, but they have not officially surrendered. They are not waving the white flag. And so within Japanese culture, the idea of giving up, surrendering, is not an option. They would rather die than to do that. And so the U.S. knows that in order to end the war, they will have to invade and make it so that it is evident for them to surrender. But they knew how dedicated the Japanese soldiers would be, and that to invade would mean a lot of lives lost. It would be a costly, bloody battle. So heavy resistance, Japanese resolve could inflict over 1 million KIA killed in action. So the amount of soldiers, civilians lost would be very substantial. So Allied leaders suggested forcing a surrender to avoid massive losses. So the U.S. is trying to come up with a way, how do we get Japan to surrender without having to invade? Some suggested conventional heavy bombing, blockading supplies, so still maybe bombings on targeted cities, making it so that supplies can't get to the island. So on March 1945, the Allies heavily bombed the capital city of Tokyo, killing 84,000 Japanese. Still no surrender. Truman turned to the alternative, the Manhattan Project. So the Manhattan Project was started under Roosevelt for the U.S. to create an atomic weapon. Einstein had left Germany. He was a famous physicist, but he was also Jewish. So he left Germany under Hitler's reign and came to the U.S. and basically said to the president, if you're going to win this war, you need to create this weapon because Germany is trying to create this weapon, so you have to create it first. And so then the Manhattan Project began as the secret project to make an atomic weapon. And so our original intention was that we have to make this weapon to defeat Hitler and Germany. That's what we thought we were competing against. So the atomic bomb. So Oppenheimer was also part of the Manhattan Project, overseeing it. Oppenheimer and other project leaders worked to make the atomic bomb ready for the U.S. by the summer. So they had different laboratories that were working on this project. It was super top secret that even people working on it didn't really know what they were working on. They were working on parts that would eventually be assembled to create this massive weapon. So you had New Mexico. I'm trying to think of the other location. I think they had like another lab in like Kentucky, and so the people in charge know what's going on, but the people working don't know what's going on. And this project was so top secret that when Truman was vice president, he didn't even know that it was going on. So it wasn't until he became president that he learned, hey, we have these atomic weapons that have been created. You also have to keep in mind that this is brand new technology, hasn't been seen, hasn't been demonstrated before, and so it really is something brand new. So when it was ready, Truman convened a group to debate using it. So now that you have this powerful weapon, can be a game changer in the war, should it be used? The lives and the damage caused by the A-bomb, they debated, would still be less than if they had invaded Japan. And ultimately at this point, they want to try to save as many American lives as possible. Truman decides to drop the atomic bomb on a Japanese city without any warning. The city chosen would be industrial and not heavily populated. And so this decision to drop an atomic bomb is very controversial. Many people disagree on whether or not a weapon that powerful should have ever been used. Many people feel that it was necessary to end the war, and it did ultimately save more lives than it did end lives. And so again, very controversial. If we have time in class, maybe we'll kind of discuss that a little bit more. Another reason people say that Truman chose to drop this weapon was as a demonstration to Stalin, to the Soviet Union, to show the might, the power of our military, in case Stalin is trying to think of attacking us later on. So, yes, we want to save lives, but we also spent so much money to create this weapon. We wanted to use it. We wanted to show other countries what the U.S. had. But Truman gave Japan one last chance to surrender. The Potsdam Conference. In July of 1945, the U.S., Great Britain, and the Soviet Union met in Germany for one last wartime meeting. The goal of this conference is post-war Germany and getting the Japanese to surrender. So in regards to Japan, the Big Three issued an ultimatum that Japan must surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. And so to Truman, that was the warning of the atomic bomb. If you do not surrender, the bomb will be dropped and the destruction will be prompt and utter. Potsdam also revealed tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union that would eventually lead to the beginnings of the Cold War. So the first target of the atomic bombs was the city of Hiroshima. Japan did not reply to the threat of utter destruction. Truman authorizes the use of the atomic weapons for the first time. So on August 6, 1945, a B-29 plane named the Enola Gay dropped the A-bomb named Little Boy on Hiroshima, Japan. So with the drop, 70,000 people died immediately. Another 35,000 were injured. The radius of destruction was about a mile, causing fires over 4.4 miles. The area was leveled and saturated with radioactive particles. So even if people didn't die immediately, there was lasting damage because of the radioactivity that caused destruction to the land, resources, nature, animals, people having radioactive infections. So there was lots more kind of long-lasting effects to the dropping of the bomb. But still, after the first bombing, Japan still did not surrender. So while the world stood in awe, Japan did not surrender unconditionally. Truman authorized the use of a second atomic weapon to be dropped on the city of Nagasaki. So 3 days later, on August 9th, 1945, the A-bomb named Fat Man is dropped on Nagasaki, Japan. 40,000 died immediately, thousands more were maimed or died of radiation. Very similar to the first one, the radius of destruction was about 1 mile. The city was leveled and completely contaminated with radioactive particles. So finally, Emperor Hirohito authorizes an unconditional surrender. So the Japanese surrender. On August 15, 1945, Hirohito addresses his nation and tearfully announces the Japanese surrender. Americans celebrate the day as VJ Day, Victory over Japan. The official surrender is signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945. And so with this surrender, World War II is officially over. So the aftermath of the war. The United Nations was created. On April 25th, 1945, 50 nations gathered in San Francisco and signed a charter to create the UN, the United Nations. The UN was meant as an international peacekeeping body, very similar in ideas and ideals to the League of Nations. That was the idea of Woodrow Wilson, but the U.S. was not a part of it. So now that we've had 2 world wars, it seems necessary for us to have this United Nations, for nations to come together, have this mediating body. They see kind of the importance of what a group like this can do. There was also the Nuremberg trials. 24 top Nazi officials were put on trial for war crimes for their parts in the Holocaust. 12 were convicted and executed. Many other top Nazi officials and soldiers fled, and so there are stories about them being tracked afterwards, brought to justice in the later 1960s, 1970s. So not all of the people responsible were put on trial. There was also the occupation of Japan. So for years after the war, the U.S. kept soldiers there to ensure that there was no type of uprising, bringing back Japanese empire. So the U.S. forces policed Japan and began to help reshape its economy. So this is the end of our notes. If you are done with these notes early, you can go back, finish up any other notes that you didn't finish in this unit. You can work on your key terms or your review sheet.